Hi and welcome to Outlaw Bookseller Exclusives. This is the first exclusive member video to focus on a specific SF novel. So I'm going to talk about a book today which I have mentioned several times in other videos about Robert Silverberg, and there's a lot of Silverberg videos on the channel, as you know. And I decided to do this one because really this is probably, for me, the most important one. And it's the one that sort of made me realise how important he was. And also, even though I've mentioned it, I haven't sort of done a full-blown thing on it. And I wanted to do this one specially for you guys who've taken the effort to join the channel and to offer a membership. So thank you very much indeed. As you see, I am resplendent today. It's the return of the scarf. I used to wear scarves all the time, didn't I, on the videos? Do you remember? I used to do that all the time. And this is a new scarf, which the video would have bought me in Edinburgh. And as you see, it's a soft clock there, a melting watch. It's some Salvador Dali's Persistence of Memory, but it's rather warm. So I'll take that off. So you'll probably see me wearing this next in a Paris video. And there'll probably be an exclusive Paris video on the channel, as well as the Michael Moorcock interview, which will happen in the regular space. So anyway, we'll go forward. And Robert Silverberg, this is interesting because I was going through a lot of my old writing the other day. I've got a new t-shirt on as well. This is specifically being worn for the first time just for you guys. You'll probably see this in one of the Paris videos as well. So I couldn't resist it. One of my favourite bands. First 4 LPs, Judas Priest, really good. After that, I'm not so sure. But it is what it is. And we'll talk about that at some point. As I say, there'll be a video coming up about them as well. And with Silverberg, this is one I came across some notes of things which never got published, and I've got a whole file of things which I was writing around about the time I was writing 100 must-read science fiction novels, which you know and love, and the other books in that series. And I came across a number of things, including finished pieces as well as notes for other books which weren't published. As I say, there was a 100 must-read horror novels, and at one point I was also talking to a publisher called Alison and Busby about doing a book called Future Watch, which would be about science fiction film and comparing it to science fiction literature. So that may well come up in here as well. But I came across this finished piece, which I'd forgotten I'd written, which is about Robert Silverberg's A Time of Changes. And this is the Gollancz Classic SF edition from 1986. I think it's 86. And it's very beautiful. And let's see. 86. Yeah, for 86. And this is one of the very first ones. This was 3. The very first tranche, they published 4 at once. And this is number 3. And I read this at the time, and it absolutely blew me away. And of course, as I've said before, these are the precursors of the masterworks. And this book was out of print for a very long time. It came back into print a couple of years ago, and I was so pleased. But it's nowhere near as beautiful as this. I think this is really beautiful. Let me just stick it in the camera. Absolutely gorgeous, isn't it? It really is. So I wrote a piece about it for 100 must-read science fiction novels, but it got left out because I put in Man in the Maze, and I'd written this, and I can't remember why this was left out. There was probably a disagreement between me and Nick, my co-author, who was also series editor, about having 2 Silverbergs in here. And, you know, if we went back to the book, reissued it, expanded it, what have you, it would be quite different. There'd be some things pulled, new things would go in. So this is based on a piece which I wrote about the book. So I'll just talk you through that now. This is the Eastern Press leather edition. I do like Eastern Press a lot. I love loads of them, but they're just so expensive and hardly anybody in the UK has got them. So this is A Time of Changes in Eastern Press. It's got gilt edges, and it's full leather, and you know, very often there's like a signed version, and this one has a frontispiece there as well, which you can see, which is the central character. But I'll just talk you through that now. And Time of Changes was published in 1971, and it's set on a planet called Bothan. It's one of these far future things where, you know, Earth has colonized the galaxy, and there's people living in all sorts of different worlds. And the sort of civilization on Bothan is quite Spartan, and it's almost medieval in its simplicity. And it was established by human settlers millennia ago. And in a way, it reminded me, looking back at it recently, of the kind of quasi-medieval thing you find in, say, Hard to Be a God with the Shagatsky brothers. And the people on Bothan have been kind of disgusted by the self-obsession that has characterized man's conquest of Earth and the galaxy. And they've devised a religion which is based on the covenant, a creed which is about the denial of the self. And such is the extremity of that belief that the words I and me are vile obscenities, and they're never uttered in polite company and scarcely voiced even between the most intimate of companions. They really are complete social no-nos. And in that way, the book is linked, I guess, to what has come to pass in recent years with the use of personal pronouns. So some people said, oh, this is the pronoun book. There's more to it than that, I would say. And it's a bit deeper than even that real discussion that's being had about those things. The story begins with the narrator, who is a fugitive prince in exile, and he's called Cynnal Darival, and he hides from the authorities in a rude shack deep in an inhospitable red desert. And there he is, writing an iconoclastic confessional testament of his sins and his redemption. And as I've said before, one of the big themes in Silverberg is redemption. And in the inhibited sort of culture of Bothan, writing autobiography is one of the ultimate crimes. It really is not something that anybody would do. And Cynnal goes one step further, and he pens his memoirs in the first person singular. So he says, I. And it begins with a very memorable opening in which he writes, I am Cynnal Darival, and I mean to tell you all about myself. And, that is an incredibly iconoclastic sentence in the culture of Bothan. So when you read the book, you follow Cynnal's fortunes as he loses his regal status. He learns how to find solace in living simply as he matures before he reacquires his power, his wealth and status in a new position of respect and authority. But what he really desires is the romantic love of his bond sister, Hallam. And even though this is a sort of relationship which isn't a genetic one, they're not relatives, the strictures of Bothan etiquette prevent him from perusing her to seek such a union. So it's not something that's allowed because they're bonded in this civic way, even though it's not a genetic thing. There comes a point there where Cynnal encounters Schweitz, who's a venal tradesman from Earth, and he unexpectedly finds himself tempted by this strangely kindred soul into taking a drug that literally fulfills the meaning of the word psychedelic, psyche and deleu, to reveal the soul. And having revealed his soul to Schweitz, Cynnal then becomes determined to spread the word, and the word is I, and he wants to spread this amongst his fellow Bothans and convince them of the richness and value of acknowledging the self. Now, of course, the psychedelic era was very much a precursor of what they called the me generation of the 70s. At least that's what people used to say at that time. And taking psychedelic drugs was often a thing about the destruction of the ego. And that actually come up in the Bar of Thodol, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which was all about seeing the collapse of the ego during a psychedelic trip. And really, it's funny because Silverberg's writing this is in 70, around 1970, and 70 when it's published, as I say. And what's fascinating is that he's sort of flipping that on its head, and he is perhaps seeing the me generation, perhaps reflecting on the fact, arguably, that the psychedelic destruction of the self was more about self-fulfillment, and I would say that's probably true. So it is quite something, and it is a book of its time, but it's still enormously powerful and very beautiful, and it's incredibly germane when you think of the world and the word that we live in now, where people have to watch what they say, they have to be very careful, and it's costing people their livelihoods and their jobs and things, and it's a really terrible thing. And, there is a certain sort of fear of this totalitarian regime in there. So it works as a dystopian novel, as a novel of personal revelation. And as I've said with Silverberg, that's a big thing. The revelatory thing is a big thing with him, the transformation. And again, this is somebody who's a prince in exile, a prince. This is somebody who's wealthy. So that, again, is another Silverberg theme. And, the thing with Silverberg is the reasons why he had massive commercial success in the 1960s when he shifted to history and archaeology and children's books. During that time, he abandoned science fiction. And his most successful book was a book called The Mound Builders of Ancient America, which is the one, and what you said with that is academics would just find out where he lived, or they'd write to him, or they'd ring him up. And they'd say, oh, I loved your book, by the way, where do you teach? And he'd say, well, I'm just a science fiction writer. I don't teach, I'm not an academic. And the reasons why these sort of books by Silverberg were so good and so acclaimed, even the ones which didn't sell, because some of them didn't sell, comes through in this, because Bothan culture is depicted in really real detail, is considerable, is plausible, but it never sort of strikes the reader as unnecessary or tedious. It's very much a great bit of world building, and it is necessary. It's not just there to sort of satisfy the sort of nerd quotient as such, and it sort of highlights his superiority really over more lumbering world building sort of styles which are out there. And I naturally think of things like Dune, and the experiences and concerns of 1960s counterculture, which was still very much alive in 71, are explored really incisively, and they provide a typically deft example of Silverberg's mastery at depicting transcendence, which is one of his perennial themes. And when Kinnell takes this drug and starts using the word I and discovers the self instead of denying the self, it's really, really quite something. And it's a book for anybody who believes in the importance of the individual as being the key minority in society. If we protect the individual, we protect everybody. So, as both literature, because it's very well written indeed, and a morality tale, it outstrips Dune, it outstrips Stranger in a Strange Land, and for my money has the best claim for being the definitive psychedelic science fiction novel, because it gets to the real core of the experience and what's important about it, rather than something superficial and groovy. This is a good bit deeper. So, unlike a lot of Silverberg's books from that period, which include things like Downward to the Earth, The Book of Skulls, Tower of Glass, Time of Changes is quite neglected today, I think. I don't see a lot about it on BookTube, and I do wish more people would read it, but I think it's really important. And of course, this one, the Nebula Award, and the Nebula Award then, the Science Fiction Writers of America, was a really important award, because it was the peers, and it was all sorts of people voting. It was people from the Golden Age, Asimov, Heinlein, what have you, and there were the new wave writers, both British and American, with the two differences that meant, with the more experimental Brits, and the few people which had gone over to the UK to write for new worlds like Tom Dish, Sladek, James Sallis, those kind of people, and the sort of taboo breakers. And this is a book about taboo breaking, obviously. So what I would say is that because this won the Nebula and because it's so neglected, I think it deserves a much higher placing in the Silverberg canon. I think you should go and buy one immediately. It's a Golag's masterwork. And if you come across one of these, do get it, because it's beautiful. But as I say, they're not cheap. If you live in the States, you'll find it much easier to get that. So that was based on, I say, a piece which was meant to go in here. While we're on the subject, and people occasionally ask me, what I would change about this. And I would change quite a lot. My main regret about this book is that I put in a book by Michael Swanwick called Stations of the Tide, and I put that in there instead of Hyperion by Dan Simmons, and I really wish I'd gone for the Dan Simmons. I think that was a fail on my part, because even though Swanwick is good, at that point I was quite influenced by the fact that Swanwick had won loads of awards and kept winning them, and I enjoyed that book. I thought it was good, and I felt it needed the balance, even though I personally enjoyed Hyperion a lot more. And I sort of felt that I would cover Dan Simmons if I did another book. And I included his book, The Song of Carly, his first novel, which I read when it came out in 87, in 100 Must-Read Books for Men, because I'd only just started writing this, and I'd only been writing it literally for I think maybe a couple of months, and my editor said to me in a phone call, you know, what would you do next? And I said, I'll have a think about it. And that's when the idea for 100 must-read books came up, because I was very optimistic and I thought, that's great. You know, even though the book isn't finished yet, it isn't published, it isn't sold, you know, there was that belief there that A&C Black and my editor Jenny had in me. And of course, that's a much told tale. You know, when you first get a deal with a publisher, you know, it's like a romance, you know, they're all over you and you're all over them. And, you know, and it's just a very positive thing. And I'm not saying it's a fake thing at all. It was very good. I had good experiences. But you do get that thing where when you get talk to other writers with experiences, you know, and initially they're in love with you, just in case you're going to become a bestseller. But I never felt that was a cynical thing on behalf of A&C Black. And just to sort of talk about the book which didn't happen, which was the fourth book in that series I was going to write, 100 must-read horror novels, I didn't actually want to do it. I wanted to take a break from the format. But Jenny, my editor, said, look, you know, we'd like you to do that. I'd like you to do this. And Duncan Boas, who co-wrote 100 must-read books of men with me, he owed me at least half a book. So I brought him on board for Books of Men. And I wrote about 65, 70% of that. And I really got Duncan in because he could write about sport. He's a great guy anyway, a great writer. So I said, you know, if we do another one, you've got to take the lion's share. So he's going to do a lot more of it. And we went back and forth, batted a list back and forth. And it never happened because when the editorial meeting for that month came around, the sort of many people said, oh, no, we don't want it. And, you know, my editor was really apologetic. And it was a mixed thing because that's really where I fell off the wagon without realizing it, but also because I wanted to take a break and do something different. So there's a bit of an insight into an unpublished piece from 100 must-read science fiction novels. And as I say, if you can pick this up, it's a masterwork these days, as I say. And it is really quite something. I would say I struggle. I can't really say which is my favourite Silverberg book. It's not Downward to the Earth, even though I rate that very highly. It's not Man in the Maze, even though I rate that very highly. It's not Tower of Glass, though I rate that highly. It's somewhere between Book of Skulls and A Time of Changes. And I think I read Book of Skulls a long time after, and I think it's the climax of that. There's a video on the channel you will have seen about the sort of ambiguity at the end of that book and its genre status. But in terms of making me realise that, you know, Silverberg was somebody I could fall in love with, it was very much this book. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. I'll see you again soon, both on this part of the channel and in the main part of the channel. And I say, let me know what you think. And I'll see you again soon. I really appreciate your support with the membership. Bye for now, guys.